This will be a day long remembered. Now I am the master.
Welcome to another episode of Legends and Theories, and welcome to my video breaking down essentially what the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse timeline is. This is going to be a little bit of a pain in the butt to do since there's just so many other branching timelines, universes like the X-Men universe, and then some confusing things brought up by Deadpool and Wolverine with it sort of contradicting with this MCU timeline list we were given by Disney a few months ago, and then there's also the pain in the butt of having to shove Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. into here. So with this, we're primarily looking at the MCU, the Fox's X-Men universe, and then the sub-MCU, which is essentially, I'm just going to look at Agent of Carter and Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. since I haven't watched all those other Marvel-related TV shows. The ones from Hulu mainly, and it's like Cloak and Dagger and stuff, which I think is supposed to be sort of set in the MCU, but because Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is so convoluted how it fits in, I don't know how those fit in. And I'm getting enough of a headache already to go through all of this, so I'll just say that's set in the, if you want to, in the Infinity War Endgame era, but I'm not going to be looking at those. And I'm also not going to be looking at ones we don't have direct references to in the MCU. So that'll be stuff like Ghost Rider and a few of the other things like Ang Lee's Hulk. I'm just looking at stuff that we fully know is MCU or was heavily referenced to be in the MCU either through. Also, there'll be spoilers for Deadpool and Wolverine in this, just in case you weren't aware, but stuff that was either in the end credits to Deadpool and Wolverine in the Fox tribute, or was referenced to in Deadpool and Wolverine. So, just a quick warning in case you're watching this, when it actually comes out and out in the future, there is spoilers to Deadpool and Wolverine, and that's the latest point in the MCU and everything else where stuff has come out. So, although we do know stuff like Kraven the Hunter and a few other projects are coming out soon, we don't know where those are set, so I'm not going to be messing with that. But this is generally just so you can figure out how to watch everything. And since it's going to be a massive pain in the butt, let's start off with our basic timeline. And how this is going to work is I'm looking at the primary MCU timeline. So this image popped up so I don't have to zoom in too much so the images aren't blurry. And then I will mention we'll be going from one movie to another movie, and then saying from that point we'll be jumping into another one. So we'll show that off with our first one. And I think I've covered all the essentials of this. So let's go straight into it, starting with the timeline. We begin with Captain America the First Avenger. Quickly, we jump to the Agent Carter TV show, which is the start of our first secondary timeline, which is the Marvel television universe. And then we quickly jump back to the MCU for the Agent Carter one shot, since I'm going roughly chronological with these. And you could say that the Agent Carter show does take place here in the main MCU, since there's not huge contradictory information besides just a little bit of timeline change for the Agent Carter one shot. But we're just gonna make things simple and just say that it is the separate universe, since there is some contradictory information. Going to the X-Men timeline, honestly, I decided to make this as simple as possible. So instead of watching these and trying to figure out which timeline you're in, I say that you watch X-Men First Class, and then, since it is an altered timeline, you watch through the entirety of the X-Men franchise from First Class to then go to Origins Wolverine, if you really want to watch that movie and feel like suffering. If not, you can just skip straight to the X-Men trilogy, then go to the Wolverine, Days of Future Past, and since there's no movies that are set between Future Past, which is I believe in the 70s, like the early to mid 70s, I can't remember the exact year, but you can go straight to Apocalypse and then Dark Phoenix, which is set slightly before Captain Marvel. I think this is like early 90s, and Captain Marvel is mid 90s. And that makes things just so much easier here because if not, I have to say you watch, first class, and you'd say you watch these, and then you'd have to, because if I really had to go through chronologically, it would be jumping through two different timelines, going from first class to Origins Wolverine, then you go to I think Apocalypse and Dark Phoenix. Well, Origins Wolverine might be set in the middle of those. Then to the X-Men trilogy, then the Wolverine, and then Days of Future Past. And of course, like the Deadpool films and stuff would be set in between those. But since this is obviously just so convoluted, I decided to break it down to the simplest point of you watch through the altered timeline, well, the original timeline, then you go to the altered timeline, and that's how you get back on track to make things as simple as possible, since no matter what, this is going to be a massive headache to go through if you're looking at it just timeline wise. So I think this is the best way to easily break it down. Now we quickly return to the MCU for Captain Marvel, and now we're going to go on a long tangent of a bunch of different universes throughout the multiverse. So I'll generally mention when we jump from universe to universe, but just in case I forget to mention, generally as we change franchise, it's going to be in a different universe, at least as far as we know, since who knows, they may eventually retcon this to all these random films that I'm about to go through were set in the same universe, but it seems unlikely, so let's just go take a look at this. And to show off just kind of how the timelines are kind of working here, I have things set slightly differently to show these universes. These are the movies that can fit on the screen, so you would go from Blade to Blade 2. Going to a new universe, we have the first Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie. We then jump to another new universe with the Daredevil movie. We return to the Raimiverse for Spider-Man 2, and finish off the Blade universe for Blade Trinity. So, I also think this is how I'm going to be generally doing it for the multiverse movies going forward, since this is just going to honestly just help show different timelines and stuff. So, we can now continue on to our next new universes because honestly, this is going to be pretty convoluted. And let's continue on. Going through our next few films. Yeah, let's see, this one is a little more confusing to when you look at it because of some of the small little gaps. But I just put it there so I could keep kind of an illusion that I've continued on from the previous chart. So, starting off, we have The Punisher. And only reason this is here is because Deadpool references how there's been multiple Punishers. So we have our first Punisher movie. We then continue the Daredevil universe with Elektra. And then jump down to a new universe again with the Fantastic Four films. Return to the Raimi universe for Spider-Man 3. And then jump off to a separate universe for Punisher Warzone. And that wraps up just our more crazy era of non-MCU films. This is essentially the 90s and 2000s, where there was no MCU and no real MCU movies set, so that makes things a lot easier. Now let's return to the main MCU for a simpler time before I have the pain in the butt of what I'm looking at is me having to jump through all the different stuff that happens with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. But before we go to that, there's some simple stuff going from Iron Man to Item 47 pretty simply. We then quickly jump over to the Amazing Spider-Man film. And now it's time for the pain in the butt of including Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. into the timeline. So remember, you're going to be jumping between the main MCU timeline and the slightly different Marvel television timeline. And we begin. You just start off Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. normally and watch it up to episode 7, The Hub. After that, you need to watch Thor the Dark World, since the episode's events are followed by The Well. You then probably should just watch Iron Man 3 since Extremis does have a big impact on it, and the MCU timeline was slightly different when this came out. Iron Man 3 was initially intended to come out before the events of Thor the Dark World, which is why it's referenced to in Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but since this has been changed around slightly now, you can watch Iron Man 3 and probably just All Hail the King just to have that nice little wrap up for the Mandarin character until he appears later. And then can return to Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. once again and go from episode 9 repairs all the way up to episode 16 end of the beginning. And then you watch the Winter Soldier movie. Then you can jump over to Turn. And after that, you can go and finish up season 1. And yeah, honestly, it was a pain in the butt to look through just how many times you have to jump between Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. episodes and MCU movies. But the cool thing about that is how it ties in really well to the MCU. But it, for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., sadly gets less and less connected to the MCU, and thankful for my sanity, it gets less and less connected while I'm having to make this timeline. So, for the simplicity of this video, it's a good thing, but for how it sets up the MCU and its connections to it, it is a sad thing since Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. was a great show. We then quickly go to the Amazing Spider-Man universe for the Amazing Spider-Man 2, and then return to the MCU, where we mainly go through the films on here normally, the films and shows actually, because this is where the TV shows enter. We can watch Guardians Volume 2, and then I Am Groot. And then throughout these next parts where we have Daredevil and Jessica Jones, I say just watch parts of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 2 throughout this, just so it doesn't feel like you're jumping through too much all at once, but you need to be at least caught up by episode 19 of Season 2 of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., titled The Dirty Half Dozen, and that's since that directly sets up the events of Age of Ultron. So then you could go watch Age of Ultron. After that, finish up Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., and then you can watch Ant-Man. And then if you feel like suffering, you can jump over and watch Fantastic. So, yeah, that movie's terrible. My review of that will probably be out like next week. But, yeah, you can jump to this movie if you want. Does come out in 2015, so I just decided to throw it after all of that stuff just so I didn't have to try and fit it into there. But technically, you watch this really whenever you want around that time, but just the simplest thing is to watch this after you see Ant-Man to wrap up 2015 Marvel. Moving on to the next year, 2016 is a little more insane with stuff jumping around. You can go through Daredevil all the way up to Defenders pretty easily. And I'd say go and watch the majority of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 3. You watch up until episode 19. Then you can watch Captain America Civil War, and then at least Black Widow and Black Panther. Both of those are set immediately after the events and will take place around the same time as Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s final few episodes. So you can watch those all around the same time. Since you only have 2 episodes left, I'd say probably watch Civil War and then I'm gonna say just watch Black Widow and Black Panther next because those are both set really close to it. Black Widow is still set during the events of Civil War, and Black Panther is set the days later. So I'd say go for that, and then you can watch the last 2 episodes of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And ultimately, you could do things slightly different. You could go watch Civil War and Black Widow, and then see Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. if you want to finish that up. It doesn't matter too much. You just need to watch these all around the same point as long as you watch, or sorry, it's the last 3 episodes. I was thinking about its cutoff being episode 20, so at least need to watch the last 3 episodes of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. combined with Black Panther and Black Widow all around the same time. They all essentially are taking place during the same few days, so it doesn't matter too much how you watch them. You just watch it at your best guess, but I'd say what the best one to do is watch Black Widow, Black Panther, and then finish Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but you can change things slightly if you want to. We then jump out of the MCU quickly and return to the Fox universe where we have Deadpool. And mainly he's here because Deadpool did come out earlier in the year. I feel like it's easier just to go through that entire MCU area there, especially with Civil War and all the other stuff taking place pretty close together. So I think that just putting him here, might be a little technically off in timeline wise, but it's a few months at the most, and this movie takes place over at least a few months, so I think that that'll make things just easier to have it here. Now going back to the MCU, we go from Spider-Man Homecoming and go all the way up to Daredevil Season 3. You can toss in as much of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Season 4 as you want. It's not super important where those happen since those don't have any tie-in points, but you can really be watching it from really as much as you want, and you could also go into the first half of season 5 until they return in season 5, episode 11, and that is when they return to the present to try and prevent this dark future. And just for the simplicity of that, that'll be set after Ant-Man and the Wasp, since that leads up to the events of Infinity War, and really only a few days to a couple weeks takes place over that back half of season 5. We now skip over to the Fox X-Men universe once again for Deadpool 2. We know that from Deadpool and Wolverine, this all takes place before it was mid-March of 2018, and that's because Deadpool goes to visit Happy Hogan in that movie, and it is, I don't remember the exact date, but it was mid-March, and this would be set before Infinity War, which would be slightly later in that year, and I think that could be proven by the fact that Happy Hogan isn't desperate to recruit him with half the universe being wiped out. So although release-wise, Deadpool 2 does come out after Infinity War, it was only like 2 weeks after. It is going to be, slightly different here and takes place just before Infinity War. Now we return once again to the MCU, and here we only have Infinity War since there's that big back gap between Infinity War and Endgame. We then go to a new universe, starting the Sony Spider-Man universe with the first Venom film. And now we have the last 2 seasons of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. While you might be thinking that Loki needs to happen for Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. to also happen, I think that it's excusable enough. You can look at it as time travel that needed to happen. And there's also the fact that they were essentially doing the TVA's job during this and were trying their best to fix the timeline. So we'll just say the TVA left that alone, and there was all development that had to happen for these characters, and it was not breaking the timeline. But there's also the Spider-Verse films, which could argue would take place around this point. But since there is a reference to something that happens in the MCU during Spider-Verse 2, I am not going to be placing them over here. Now, returning to the MCU, we go from Endgame to What If Season 1. We then jump over to Into the Spider-Verse. Since I'd say about a year having between this and the next point that we need to happen, which is No Way Home, is at least logical enough. We then return to the MCU and watch up to the point on here where it says the Eternals. Again, No Way Home is supposed to be there, but since it wasn't on Disney Plus, I don't think it was included in this list. But that's obviously MCU canon, so I don't know why they excluded it. But going up to this point, there's also a note that technically Deadpool and Wolverine should take place timeline-wise around Falcon and Winter Soldier or the time of Far From Home. Big problem is it's very clear that's set after the events of Loki Season 2. So while technically timeline-wise, this takes place over here, it would actually have to take place after the events of Loki Season 2 for whatever reason instead to take place after everything that's currently happened in the MCU. So unless this official timeline is changed, Deadpool and Wolverine can't take place around here, and we'll just say that years pass longer, or time is slower in the Fox X-Men universe than in the timeline of the MCU. Also, technically, No Way Home takes place immediately after Far From Home, but the events of other stuff and the time gap makes it be set right after Eternals. So we then have Venom, which leads directly into No Way Home, with Venom being transported to the MCU, and that's immediately preceded by Morbius, which I mean is technically taking place at the same time as No Way Home since Vulture is transported at the end. You could technically watch Morbius before, but I think the transition just works a lot better going straight from Venom to No Way Home. So let's move on now back to the main MCU. We then go and watch Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and immediately after that, we get our next Spider-Verse film. We don't know how much time passes between this one and the next Spider-Verse film since that hasn't been released yet, so it could be immediately after this, it could not, but you'll have to wait for that one to come out to know. And the reason that it's set here is because we see a map of the multiverse in it, and it still looks like the one before the events of Loki Season 2. So we know that this is set before Loki Season 2, which is why I set it around here, with Loki Season 1 having to happen, but the events of Loki Season 2 not happening yet. So I think this is the best place to put it. And it's slightly after Doctor Strange, just so some time has passed. So there's enough time for them to know about everything that happened and for the entire Spider Society to be built. But I think that's about the best you could guess about where it happens. And now let's go to finish up the MCU. And here we just finished everything that is currently in the MCU, and that is at the furthest point of stuff that's fully set in the MCU is technically the Marvels, with Loki, What If, and Deadpool and Wolverine being set in other universes. And that brings us to obviously Deadpool and Wolverine. As I said, this has to be set after the events of Loki Season 2 since the TVA is fully in its new mode. Although we don't see the tree that has been brought up by Loki, we can see that B-15 is in charge of the TVA. We don't have Mobius there at all, so the events of Loki have already been completed. And looking at really everything, we can tell that Deadpool and Wolverine takes place here. It's still before the events of Logan, since that's where it takes place timeline-wise, and the only reason Deadpool knows of what happened is because Deadpool has seen through the fourth wall and knows what we've all watched with Logan. So we then go to our last two films here, being The New Mutants and finally Logan. And that ultimately wraps up the timeline. And I hope this wasn't too confusing. And there's obviously no way I can make a graph of this because of just how much stuff there is, and I personally don't have the capability of doing that and making it still readable. But this timeline was honestly kind of pain in the butt to do, but a lot of fun, and I hope it was helpful. I want to know what you think, though. Please let me know in the comments, and also in the next episode of Legends and Theories. Thank you for watching this episode of Legends and Theories. Please subscribe, like the video, share the video, leave a comment, check out the video on screen, and may the Force be with you.